Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me at this symposium. I'm really excited to be here in an actual auditorium talking to actual humans. It's very exciting. I am a research scientist at DeepMind, and I work on the neuroscience team there. So I work on some problems that are in the machine learning space and some problems that are in the neuroscience space. In both of these areas, I'm interested in the problem of how to learn structure about the world and represent it in a way that lets you support flexible downstream behavior. One of the reasons that this problem is interesting to work on in both the neuroscience and machine learning directions is that it's one of these areas where humans and animals are much better than machines. That's also true of social reasoning too. With flexible reasoning, while we get machines that can do very complicated behaviors, they often are very specialized and have trouble transferring their knowledge to new settings. So we think that the way that humans represent knowledge in animals might be more flexible. How does this? How do I advance slides? Got it. So I think a nice demonstration of the way that we represent rich information in a structured way is this map that I saw in a museum once, and so I took a picture of it. And the reason that I liked this particular picture is I think it represents the challenge of representing lots of different types of experience in a single unified representation that you could use for lots of things. So this particular map has lots of different reference frames in it, different coordinate frames that are all kind of smooshed together. You have egocentric representations and first-person views of the houses, and you also have a more global picture of how the roads fit together and how you could navigate from place to place. Some things are represented in a lot of detail, and some things, like the space in between the roads, is hardly represented at all. So this map was made by a human, but as far as we know, animals also represent structure about the world. And in particular, we know a lot about how physical space is represented in the rodent brain. So in Hippocampus, which is shown in red on this depiction of a rodent brain, you can record cells called place cells that fire whenever the animal is in a particular location in space. In a nearby region called entorhinal cortex, you also find cells that are spatially receptive that fire at different locations in space. However, they have multiple spatially receptive fields that are all packed together in this hexagonal grid. So they're called grid fields. And these cells have been a really big deal in neuroscience. They have spawned a lot of investigation into how physical space is represented in the brain. We know that a lot of spatial variables are represented in these areas, not just location, but things like direction and landmarks and boundaries and things of that nature. So one thing that we're starting to see, though, in the rodent brain is that it's not just physical space that's represented in these populations. In a task where animals are shown a rising pitch, a tone that increases in its frequency, you'll find cells in hippocampus that encode pitch in the similar way that they would physical space. And in another really differently structured task, humans were shown these videos of morphing birds that had 2 dimensions of variation, the length of their neck and the length of their legs. And in the human subjects with fMRI, evidence of grid-like representations was found in the part of the brain where we see grid cells in rodents. So importantly, these tasks have the same kind of underlying structure as physical space. They're Euclidean. They can be represented as a 1-dimensional track or a 2-dimensional plane. But one thing we're seeing more now is that it's not just physical space, and it's not just tasks with the same underlying structure as physical space, but in tasks that are better represented as some kind of discrete space, like a graph or a Markov decision process, we also see hippocampus representing location in these tasks in a similar way. We see hippocampal cells that care about your location in these more abstract and arbitrarily connected environments. So this is consistent with some older ideas in the hippocampus modeling literature that maybe hippocampus is representing not necessarily a map of space in a purely spatial way, but rather how things connect to each other, the relations between different states, and that the relations between physical locations in space is just one example of this that you could include in the broader set. This idea that it's representing a model that you can use for reinforcement learning is a really related idea. And I think one thing that's worth considering at this point is what these different types of representation schemes imply for the downstream computation. One thing that's really useful from this idea that we get spatial representations and represent spatial variables is these representations could be really powerful. Lots of different navigation tasks have the same underlying structure, and representing this means that you could reuse these computations in different settings. You can use the same idea of like how I go really far away or how I travel in a single direction. However, these types of spaces are more limited. They can't necessarily account for as many different types of geometries. These relational spaces are much more mathematically expressive objects, and we can get more types of tasks in them. So what we want to do is try and think of a framework where we can get the best of both worlds, all the different representational properties we want that permit different kinds of downstream computations. So the perspective that we're going to take for looking at this is the reinforcement learning framework. And the reinforcement learning task is this. Given some task, an agent is going to learn a policy for taking actions that maximize its total expected reward over its future states by trial and error. One of the things that we really like about this framework is that it's very minimally specified and general. We can apply it to lots of different types of problems. So we could apply it to games like chess or like Go or Atari games, where your state is the configuration of pieces on the board and you want to maximize your probability of winning the game. We could apply it to a problem like trying to make goofy faces to make a baby laugh, which I did when I visited my friend's baby recently. And we can apply it to problems like navigation, where you maybe have a maze like this rat does, and you're trying to maximize the expected number of Fruit Loops you get as you traverse this maze. Fruit Loops are a tasty morsel that rats tend to enjoy. And we have a lot of choices for this maze of how we can represent the environment that we're trying to reason about. So one natural choice might be XY coordinates, to use the Cartesian representation of space and use that as our state representation to feed into a reinforcement learning process. We might want to discretize space and represent every kind of chunk of space as a completely different unit that we're going to learn about. Or maybe we'll represent all dead ends as kind of unified chunks and learn anything about a single dead end at one time, which could be efficient for certain planning processes. Basically, we have a lot of choices. And the particular choice we make has a lot of implications for the downstream learning process. It could take a really long time, or it could take not very much time at all, depending on what our choice is for representing space. So our question here that we're going to use to start considering hippocampal data is, does the cognitive map in hippocampus, does the way physical space is represented in hippocampus and entorhinal cortex create a representation of state that can make reinforcement learning more efficient? This is the way we'll set up this problem of representing the environment so as to make downstream computations easier. And this idea in machine learning is called representation learning, and it basically addresses this idea that you can learn a representation of space that's going to simplify future learning problems. So for this, we're going to focus on some of the particular problems that RL has. Reinforcement learning is not known to be especially sample efficient. It can take a really long time to learn about your environment, and that's what we want to try and address with our state representation. One of the reasons for this is that reward can be very sparse. If you're taking a very agnostic perspective to learning about your environment and you only want to learn what's rewarding, then you only get information very rarely. Really, only these Fruit Loop locations, for instance, might be rewarded. It'll take a really long time to propagate that information to other decisions you might make. And if you've got a lot of states to learn about, that can also be a challenge. So these are really the key questions that we'll deal with. So this first is, if reward is sparse, if that's not giving you a very strong signal, what other information about the environment should you start encoding? One answer to this question that we used is the idea that you should try and make predictions about what's going to happen next. So basically, you're going to represent your current state in terms of future outcomes that might happen. And this kind of automatically accounts for any future outcomes that you can expect and lets you anticipate upcoming events. Another problem is how we deal with high-dimensional problems. So if you have a lot of states that you have to learn about, it will take you a really long time. And we can use tools from compression to try and make it so we have fewer things to learn about. So you end up grouping states together, having a common description for multiple states that lets you learn about more than one at a time. So in a 2017 paper, we basically hypothesized that these two roles in representation learning could be used to motivate the representations that you see in different parts of the hippocampal formation. So our hypothesis is that place cells are representing a prediction of what states are going to happen next, and that this is useful for efficient learning. The particular representation we used is something called the successor representation that was proposed by Peter Dayan in 1993. And for the grid cells in entorhinal cortex, we hypothesized that these are capturing the low-dimensional structure among the predictions. These are compressing these and creating a representation of the environment that you can learn about more quickly. And this is consistent with this idea of proto-value functions that was proposed by Mahadavan in 2007. So I'll first show, so I'm going to mostly talk about the grid cell model today because I think it segues into some of the machine learning work that I want to talk about. But I did want to just briefly mention two ways that we've been extending these predictive models recently. And this is work that's been done by Jesse Gerritz during his PhD at UCL with Neil Burgess, and with me also. So in one of these works, we combine different learning strategies. We show how this predictive representation can be combined with learning mechanisms in striatum that are thought to be doing more of an associative learning process. This model came out in PNAS last year. And in another work that Jesse's working on now, we talk about extending the predictive representations to account for uncertainty. And we incorporate uncertainty in a couple different ways. One way that we incorporate it is to have uncertainty about which states are going to happen next and use this to update your map. So if you think some state's going to happen but you're not totally sure, then you might want to update your expectations accordingly. And we also have an aspect where you might not be sure which environment you're in at the time, and that also should inform how you're learning about your environment, how you're building a structure of how states connect to each other. So for the grid cell part, we're modeling grid cells as representing the compressed predictions. So if we represent this in a more mathematical form, we're going to have a matrix which is representing your predictions about the future. In this case, it's the successor representation matrix, and it is for this problem where we have a rodent that's on some location on a discretized track. So we basically are going to assume that our agent is taking a random walk, and so it predicts that it's going to visit states to the left and right of it for any location. Every entry in this matrix contains some expectation about the future. In the rows are starting states and the columns are visited states. So this state here would say the expected number of visits to the column state given some row state that you're starting with. One way that you can do compression in a simple linear algebra type of way is to take the eigendecomposition of this matrix. And this involves rewriting the successor representation as a product of three matrices. The first is a matrix of eigenvectors, the second has eigenvalues in it, and the third is the same matrix of eigenvectors again, but now transposed to be on its side. I think if you're looking at this and saying, I don't really know what eigenvectors are and I'm not that excited to learn in the next 30 seconds, I think one way to summarize this is that if you truncate the eigenvectors, if you only use maybe 6 of them or 3 of them or 2 of them and you multiply them back together, then you can reconstruct your original matrix, but with a loss of some of the precision and the detail. You can get a more coarse representation. So in this case, we're keeping 6 of the eigenvectors, and you can see we reconstruct a matrix that has sort of the same overall structure as the matrix above it, but it doesn't have as much sharpness along the peak, along the diagonal. It's a little bit coarser. And if we keep fewer and fewer eigenvectors, then we get a coarser and coarser representation of this environment. So I think this is one way to think about the way in which these eigenvectors contribute to compression. So if we look at the eigenvectors for not a 1D environment, but for a 2D environment, we see we get these kind of grid-like patterns, which in a lot of ways are similar to grid cells. So this was sort of one of the reasons at first that we wanted to use this as a model of grid cells. Like, oh, wow, they look kind of grid-like. And because this model is anchored to the transition structure of the environment, because it's anchored to how states predict each other rather than spatial coordinates, this can predict some of the ways in which boundaries and irregular geometries alter the firing of grid cells. This is also related to a lot of other approaches that derive grid cells from the statistical structure of space. Rather than saying these are purely spatial, they emerge from how space is connected. And this lets us capture a couple different phenomena, which I'll just kind of briefly show. What unifies all of these is that they have to do with how space is interrupted by irregular boundaries and transitions. And I mentioned that one of the things that's useful about these is that they're anchored to not spatial coordinates, but the way space is generally connected up. And this allows us to capture structure in environments that aren't necessarily spatial and have maybe a different kind of structure associated with them. So if we have a low-dimensional manifold, then we can capture these coordinates, and this is what the first few eigenvectors will show you. If we have an environment that's better represented with clusters, the first few eigenvectors will sort of tease these clusters apart, and this is often used in spectral clustering algorithms. And if you have symmetries in your environment or ways you can rotate the graph onto itself, then you'll end up with multiple eigenvectors that have the same eigenvalue. You also can get multiscale representations with these eigenvectors if you order them by their eigenvalue. So what that looks like in environments that have underlying spatial structure, maybe, that are more like a track or a plane, is you get these sinusoids that are 1D or 2D. You get these wave-like representations. And if you have environments that have different kinds of structure associated with them, you get different kinds of waves, waves that look like they're more warped to the particular structure of the graph. But in all of these, if you order by eigenvalue, you get waves that have very large peaks, and then waves that have an increasing number and smaller peaks as you get to the higher frequency components. And one thing that this is really useful for is organizing information by its scale. With graphs, it can be hard to know, it can be hard to have a notion of what it means to be far away. And this is because in normal space, I could say, go in a straight line for a really long time and see where you end up. You have a notion of continuing in the same direction. But in graphs, you don't really have a notion of direction. And if you want to say something like, go really far away or stay close, then you need this notion of what it means to be in a really far away part of the space. So this fundamentally requires like a multi-scale organization where you can say, I want to go far away or I want to stay near. This isn't the only way to get it, but it's one way we can do it for graphs in relational spaces. One of the things that this is useful for, which Dan McNamee wrote about in a recent paper, is that you can use this for creating distributions that have different statistics. So for instance, when animals are foraging, they tend to follow a policy where they locally explore an area, but then occasionally take a big jump to a faraway part of the space. If we want to specify this for relational spaces, we can construct a version of this distribution that's built on these eigenvectors and translates a notion to a big jump to these spaces. We also see that animals have, basically, there's many different types of distributions that can be useful for different sampling, for different cognitive behaviors. So if you're foraging, that's the strategy you might want, but if you're trying to replay activity in order to learn a better representation of your environment, or you're replaying activity because you want to try and make a decision, you're trying to plan about the future, the statistics of how you would sample from your model are really different. And one of the ways that we can describe this is that you're sampling from different scales in a different way. So we can basically create these distributions for different kinds of relational spaces using this as a basis. So in the last couple minutes, I'm just going to talk about, basically briefly preview some of the machine learning research that we've been doing, transferring similar mathematical ideas to the neural network world. And to soften the abruptness of this transition, I'll just highlight that there's a different conceptual problem we're working on in machine learning, whereas neuroscience, we want to understand how does the brain do something. In machine learning, we want to say, how can we get machines to do it really well? It's more of a performance metric. And in this case, we want to try and reason about these different types of structure in relational environments in a useful way. One of the main tools for doing this is something that's called graph neural networks. These have been successful in a lot of different areas of machine learning. They're really like having a moment right now. And they're basically useful whenever you want to reason about a problem that is best described as a graph, where you want to consider how different entities relate to each other. So that might be how molecules relate to each other, how proteins interact, how the parts of a robot should coordinate each other, how particles interact in a fluid. They've been used a little bit recently in neuroscience to model functional connectivity in the brain. And then you can also set up lots of different types of problems that are maybe not necessarily graphical, they're image-based reasoning, as graph problems, because graphs are a pretty general object. So if you want to reason about how things relate to each other in an image, you might still use a GraphNet rather than a convolutional neural network to do the relational part of that. Oh yeah, that's a fun simulation. So the way that these basically work is by something called message passing. So in message passing, you start off with a graph, and each node in this graph is associated with some feature, or a vector that really describes its properties. And you're going to update each node as a function of its neighbors. So you're going to take the features from all of your immediate neighbors, the nodes that are one step away from you, you're going to sum them together, and you'll concatenate them onto your current feature representation. Then the neural network part is that you feed this through a neural network, and this becomes your new state representation for each node. So basically, you are propagating information through the graph and sending it through neural networks each time you pass it around. And this is often referred to as message passing. The challenge of this is that computations that require distant nodes to communicate with each other require lots of message passing steps. This can basically degrade your signal and cause some problems. It can also take a long time because these message passing iterations are slow. So what we want to try and do is use the same sort of mathematical tools to leverage the structure of the graph to process global information. And to do that, we developed something called hierarchical spectral GraphNets. These combine the eigenvectors that we introduced earlier with mechanisms for instilling hierarchy in graph neural networks. I think I'm a little lower on time than I thought I'd be at this point, so I'm going to skip through the details of how we implemented this. But basically, we use a normal GraphNet that does message passing and combine this with a spectral graph that represents the low-dimensional structure of how the graph is structured. So basically, what this lets us do is get better results in some problems and to get more efficient training in other types of problems. So we looked at some image as graph classification problems where we basically did image classification but just represented the image as a graph. And we get performance improvements in those domains. We also looked at some standard molecular property prediction tasks and see that we get much faster training when we use this. And we looked at shortest path prediction in problems where the graphs have different statistics associated with them and find that in some problems, this helps a lot. So in this plot on the left, where we have graphs with a large number of nodes that have low-dimensional structure, this augmentation helps. But in different types of problems, we see it doesn't help that much. And these are really cases where you either don't need global structure at all, or the global structure is actively misleading. Maybe you're trying to represent something about clusters that aren't there. So just to conclude, I wanted, because the focus of this is how to use neuroscience and machine learning to augment each other, I wanted to briefly mention what I think the level of analogy is between these projects. I think that the spectral GraphNet is definitely not a model of Hippocampus in any way. I think the way it does graph processing is really different. However, it does have these shared themes of how you can integrate global geometry with local computation in order to do things more efficiently. So I think this is an idea that we've thought about in particular ways in neuroscience about like specificity versus transfer. And in machine learning, we think about that as like, how do we avoid oversmoothing? How do we use local computations to get more complex functions? And these different ways of thinking about the problem, I think, can leverage each other and be useful for transferring at some level of abstraction that we eventually find. So thanks. I want to thank my collaborators, and thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to take a few questions.